G'day folks, welcome to another special presentation from Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. It's all about heat stress management. You're doing it wrong, and it's presented by Dr. Matt Brearley, an expert occupational heat stress consultant. I'm Chris Bombolis, Media Manager for the Office of Industrial Relations, and I'll be your MC for today. Firstly, can I acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples watching today. Safe Work Month is held every October and is all about raising awareness of work health and safety. This year, Safe Work Month looks a little different thanks to our friend COVID-19. In this practical session, we'll look at evidence-based approaches to address heat stress and equip you with the knowledge to better manage the risks of occupational heat. The record heat of recent summer wet seasons has refocused attention on occupational heat and humidity exposure. Since heat stress is not readily quantified by organisations and often normalised by workers who will say heat stress is just part of my job, it tends to be grossly underreported. This not only threatens the health and safety of workers on a seasonal basis, but also hampers organisational efforts to manage heat stress. Additional barriers include relying on hydration as a control measure and under-utilising complementary strategies such as heat acclimatisation and cooling. Dr. Matt Brearley is Australia's preeminent occupational heat stress consultant, conducting and applying research to guide industry practice. He's the 2018 Exercise Scientist of the Year, holds a PhD in thermal physiology and has developed practical evidence-based procedures to maximise health, safety and performance in the heat. Matt and a team of international colleagues develop resources on behalf of the World Health Organization and partners regarding heat stress management for COVID-19 responders. And don't forget, there's a Q&A session after Matt's presentation, and I can tell you that there's already a number of people with questions. So if you want to get a question in or you want to give us a comment, please submit it via the chat box on your screen at any time. We'll get to as many of those questions and comments as we can after Matt's presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks for the intro, Chris, and welcome everyone. Heat stress management, you're doing it wrong. As Chris has said, I'm Matt, and I've been looking forward to this session for some time. There's a few things that I've wanted to get off my chest, and this is the perfect presentation to do it. I just want to start by saying that these observations and research that I'm about to present generally come from field settings, and this is where I do the work. It's where the work gets done. So you've got a picture here of a hot, dry climate. This is a great sandy desert, as remote as it gets. It could be from a hot, wet underground mine where no solar radiation, so it's a different setting, or it could be up on the surface in a hot, wet tropical setting where there was lots of solar radiation before this storm came through. And this may be from a boat, but it's all heat stress. So I call myself a field scientist and doing field research. It's probably a bit different to being this person here who I call a heat nerd. I call myself a heat nerd. Maybe I should call myself a field heat nerd. So if these opinions and I guess points I make don't sit well with you, that's cool. I'm cool with that. But they will be based on evidence, and I don't want you to discount them simply because you think they've come from somewhere deep in a lab. And evidence is key because I'm a scientist, right? So there's science and there's pseudoscience. And from my point of view, pseudoscience is everywhere through heat stress management, particularly on the hydration side of things. So I'm going to try and shift it towards the science side. So we'll stick with the white and try and minimize the blue, but you'll have to hold me accountable to that. So I need to show you evidence. And so as a scientist, I follow the evidence wherever it leads. It doesn't matter what the answer is, as long as it's the truth, right? But down the bottom on the science side, you also see changes with new evidence. And that's really important. And I'm hoping I can change a few viewpoints today based upon evidence. Now, pseudoscience is not that hard to pick. It's everywhere, but it's quite easy to see, particularly where you look at maybe point 5 there, cherry picks only favourable evidence, relies on testimonials. I'll show you a testimonial later in this presentation, which clearly identifies it as pseudoscience. Here we go. The 5 issues I picked today, and maybe we do another session for another 5 that I wanted to present, but these are they. Underreporting of heat stress. The next 3 are related to hydration. And the most important one is management of heat stroke. I'm very passionate about that, and I think we'll spend more time on that one than the others. All right, let's kick it off. Underreporting of heat stress. So this came through on my LinkedIn feed this week, and I have no relation to this company and do not know anything about their heat stress campaign. So I'm not critiquing it. I'm simply using this as a talking point. But what got me was successful closing of the heat stress campaign with 0 incident. And that's great. Sounds like no one got hurt in the heat. And I hope that's the case. But I see a lot of this, and I just wonder, because we do research by asking workers through an anonymous survey about their heat stress. So this paper's in development. Well, the paper's written. I just can't submit it because it's too many words. The journal doesn't allow that many words. So we'll need to split this paper, but pre-Christmas, this will get submitted. So we looked at a small crew, 73 workers based up in the Northern Territory. They're chronically heat exposed. From my point of view, up there, it's as hot and as humid as it gets. And they're extremely resilient workforce. But they suffer heat stress symptoms, and we don't pretend that they're fine. There's symptoms there, right? But a male-dominated workforce generally not going to report these type of symptoms, and they're not always visible, so they can carry on without actually letting anyone know. But through the survey, being anonymous, these are the type of results we get. Now you see 31% fatigue, 28% irritability. These are reported on a daily or weekly basis. So these are the number of workers, the proportion of workers reporting symptoms chronically across a 7-month period. Okay. Now those symptoms translate to impacts in the home environment. Heat stress doesn't finish when we leave work, unfortunately. And the impacts that these same workers reported are here. Sleep, appetite, impact on recreation, might skip football training, might not go and play with the kids because you're still paying for the heat exposure of that shift. And family relationships for 1 in 6 workers was negatively impacted by heat. It's scary. We've had some surveys where it's been over 30% on that factor. Okay, so does this count as 0 impact? 0 incident? I'm not sure. But here's the kicker. 18% of those workers reported that they use sick leave for heat-related issues. Now, this company doesn't have a drop-down box when you put in your sick leave to say heat. Not at all. These workers utilised another category. I wouldn't say fake. I believe that they were ill, but they were using another term to describe it, to apply for it. So 18% of workers. How many of your workers are using sick leave to manage their heat stress? I'd be interested to know. There's no data out there about this. Those workers, the 18%, averaged 3 to 4 days over that 7-month period, but only 1 treatable incident. So unlike the slide that said 0 incidents, we had 1 in this company. And now this stat has been used to promote the success of the heat stress program, because there used to be more and now there's 1. I don't think it should be celebrated. There's a lot of heat stress within that crew, both at work and then at home. And it's causing some of them to take sick leave. And these are extremely resilient workers. Like, they're tough. What is actually happening out there? So we don't know. I feel very uncomfortable when I see 0 incident or 1 incident from a heat exposed workforce over an extended period. I feel really uncomfortable about that, because I think the reality is that it's more, and we don't know, and therefore we can't manage it. It's left to the workers to self-manage, and sometimes their management of heat stress may not be healthy long-term for them. They may numb the pain in the post-work environment. They may take shortcuts at work because they simply can't do what's being asked of them. All these things can contribute to harm while the work is getting done, both at home as well. Yeah, so that's my first point. I think underreporting heat stress is a very, very big deal for us. Point 2, so we start with the hydration theme now. So the next 3 will be hydration. Dehydration as the primary cause of heat-related illness. I can't tell you how many times we've been told that, we were on site to investigate a heat-related incident, or we're just doing heat stress control measures, and, you should have been here the other day. Yeah, Mark, he collapsed with heat. Oh yeah, what was the go? Oh, he's dehydrated. Oh, how do you know? Oh, he was dehydrated. I'm like, wow, I don't even know. I wouldn't be able to tell that straight up. How can you? And it seems like dehydration gets blamed for all heat-related issues. And so it's very common to hear workers who complain and put their hand up and have the courage to say, hey, I'm feeling the heat, which is a great thing to do. But I hear the response from managers, co-workers, etc. You need to drink more. You need to drink more. Well, we can drink more. We can, and some of them may need to. But is that the answer to all the issues in the heat? And I seriously don't think it is. But I need evidence to prove that point to you. So in comes the paper of Carter et al. 2005. So this is an old paper, 15 years old. The data finished in 2002. So it's actually 18 years plus on this data, but it's still the best study looking at basically factors that are associated with heat stroke and serious heat-related issues. So US Army are very, very good in this space. They do a lot of monitoring. They do a lot of research. They publish a lot, and we can learn a lot from them. And over their 22 years of data, they had over 5,000 hospitalizations for heat-related illness. That's an incredible amount. Of those, 946, almost 1,000 were clinical heat stroke, like really serious. So heat stroke being a core temperature over 40.5, central nervous system impairment. It's really serious. So life-threatening, and 37 deaths within that data. So this is some hardcore heat stress data, the best set of data that we've got out there in the research. Now, 160 of those cases were associated with dehydration. So those 946 serious heat stroke cases, only 160 were associated with dehydration. We represent that graphically. The yellow are those associated with dehydration. That's 17%. 17%. Now, this could be a one-off. I highly doubt it given the size of the sample, but the Israeli army also published data in a much smaller subset. Of having 946 cases, they had 89, but they reported 22% associated with dehydration. I think there's something going on here. I think dehydration is a contributor, yes. Please don't think I'm telling you that it's okay for workers to be dehydrated. I'm not. I just don't think it is the answer. And in this case, we're looking at about 1 in 5 serious heat stroke cases being associated with dehydration. Now, the case of Trooper Lawrence data, it takes the US data and brings it home. This is in Australia. This happened in the Northern Territory. This is Trooper Lawrence. I feel like I knew Trooper Lawrence. I've studied his case very, very closely. It's an extremely sad case. I don't really like talking about it anymore, but I think it's so important to discuss. And I've met in my travels talking about heat 4 of his colleagues who were there on the day that he passed away. It's still affecting some of those workers. But this is a coronial report. Very high level of evidence here. Now, the key point with Trooper Lawrence's case is that he was hydrated. He was hydrated. So they're up at 0430. The period through to 1200, he reported to Private Chat, the Army medic at that point, that he had consumed about 8 litres in about 8 hours. So that's a litre an hour. That's pretty solid. He'd gone to the toilet. He'd passed urine 6 times. That suggests that there was adequate. I classify that as hydrated. Now, when the coroner was quizzing Dr. Stephen Rodsky, he had this question. I think the key part here in the orange, the constant theme is one of dehydration as a threat, and commendable effort was put into ensuring hydration. But no one was dealing with the core temperature, the work rate, the conditions. These conditions were hideous. They were working extremely hard. Trooper Lawrence was trying to get his corporal promotion, and he was on the 4th day of that. He was almost at the end. He was such a great guy that he volunteered to be in the platoon for his colleague to go through their final assessment. He passed. And yeah, it went bad from there. So he got to Royal Darwin Hospital around about 6 hours post-collapse, he died. He got to Royal Durham Hospital 3 hours post-collapse, 41.7 core temperature, 41.7. This guy had gone to the toilet 6 times in those 8 hours. He drank 8 litres, and they thought that he might have been dehydrated, or that could be the only thing that explained his symptoms. So they put intravenous fluids into him on top of what he'd already drunk. So please don't say to every worker that you need to drink more without investigating. I think it can explain some, but not all of the heat stress we see on work sites. There's evidence out there if you look. So one's a case report, high work output combined with high ambient temperatures cause heat exhaustion in a firing. Now that got put out in 2011 as a case report because it's novel, but this is happening a lot. And so we see Mark Schechner and his group from California, they just published a paper last year. They looked at a few factors and they found that core temperature in these outdoor workers going about their business, again from the field, was determined by the weather and the work rate. Work rate determines your heat production and the weather determines how much you can dissipate. The net result is core temperature either going up or down. And in hot, dry, and even hot, humid conditions, core temperature goes up with high work rates because we can't get rid of that heat, whether we're hydrated or not. Now, hydration can blunt that rise, but it can't stop it. So the message I want to give you is that you don't think you can drink your way out of a heat stroke. If you work hard enough in hot conditions, you'll still store enough heat to achieve that. Hydration theme number 2, issue number 3. Cool fluids delay rehydration. This has been a tough one, very, very tough one for me. And dealing with this issue, I came up against a lot of barriers. So I'm on a work site. There's many, many workers, like thousands of workers on the site, and one contractor had approximately 1,500 on site. I'm there to do some work. It's all good. We haven't done a lot of prep. I got a referral, so I come in and do some education. And so it was a meet and greet, but straight into a session. As I walk into office area, there's a room full of workers. There's about 20, 25 workers in there, and not a lot's happening. It's kind of like, okay, is it those guys there for a session because we're not scheduled for another hour? No, they're dehydrated. Okay, cool. And it was just bugging me. I didn't want to overstep the mark, but then I sort of come back 5 minutes later. I said, so what's the go with the guys in that room? Oh, yeah, they're dehydrated, so we've got to make sure they're rehydrated before they go back out on site. I said, oh, that sounds fine. How do you know they're dehydrated? Oh, we've done a urine test. Now, urine test was number 6. I didn't have time to put it in. Maybe next session. There's a whole lot of issues around that as well. Maybe not evidence-based, but we'll get there. Now, in terms of them being dehydrated, why aren't they in there drinking? They all have drinks in front of them, the paper cups with water, but there's very little activity. And to me, it seems strange. So get rehydrated and get back to work. Let's go. I said, do you mind if I go and catch up with the crew? Oh, yeah, sure. And so, hey, lads, what's going on? I hear you're a bit dehydrated. Oh, yeah. I said, so why aren't you rehydrating? I won't repeat the exact words, but they make us drink this water. I'm like, yeah, what's wrong with that? Do you want some flavoring? No, it's warm. I said, what do you mean the water's warm? Yeah, they make us drink warm fluids. I said, why? Because it rehydrates you quicker. You can't put cold water in your guts, apparently. I said, really? Oh, that's news to me. I hear it a lot, but the evidence says that you can. And so you can imagine the session I had ready to deliver to this crew and massive workforce was full of slides that basically supported their access to cold fluid against the advice of the HSC team. So we had a lot of issues right before the presentation. And I got asked, where's your evidence? Now, I can bring in papers and highlight paragraphs. I said, right, I'll write a paper. And I did. And it's there. And I think you've got access to the PDF that we developed. We put a whole lot of links in there. There's some videos, etc. And I believe there's a link to this paper. It's a short read, 5-minute read. It's not very sciencey, but it is full of evidence. So have a look at that. I'll explain it here. So here we have our worker rehydrating. So she's taking a short break and she's topping up her fluids. Now, if she's like the workers that we deal with, we sampled 190 workers in the paper by Carter. They said that 54% said, they prefer cool and 32% prefer cold fluids. So combined, it's 82% who like cool or cold fluids from that sample. So if she was to fall into that group, she'd be drinking maybe 15 degrees cool water. She might like 5-degree water full of ice, whatever. Now, most work sites have access to cold fluids as a control measure. This is a study from Zhang in PLOS 1, 97% of Australian workforces. That was from a survey done at the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists meeting, their annual meeting, attended by obviously occupational hygienists, but also some safety professionals. So 180 respondents there, and pretty much universally, cool water was one of the control methods for heat stress. This is all good, right? So that all seems to work. Now on this side, if we look at her consumption, so she's drinking this cool fluid. So at some point along here, it has to be delayed because it's cool. And so what I get told by workers is that it gets stuck in the stomach until it warms up. And once it's warmed up, then it gets released. I'm like, right, but that's not what the evidence says. So what is going on here? Now, the rate at which fluid leaves our gut is all about gastric emptying. That's the fancy term for it. And it's how quickly this fluid gets released past the pyloric sphincter into the intestines where it can be utilized by the body. So gastric emptying is regulated by two main factors, okay? Have a very, very dense drink in terms of energy, yeah, it'll slow down 100%. Increase the volume and you increase the intragastric pressure and you will speed up emptying as well. They're the two factors. Temperature plays an extremely minor role, in my opinion, no role. And read the paper and see what you think. Now, this is from Leaper in the Nutrition Reviews paper. He's just put some mock data together, but to show you that gastric volume is a key regulator. So yeah, high volume in there, you got a high emptying rate. That makes sense. But we don't tend to drink like this is one big bolus and then 80 minutes without drinking. And on a work site, it look more like that. And that's fine. But what role for temperature? I think minimal. So we should be giving our workers access to cold fluids, in my opinion. They don't have to use them. They might just have access to potable water and an ice machine, and then they can make it up themselves. I think that's a good idea. In terms of determinants of fluid consumption, I thought I'd throw this in there because you probably got a question, well, you're talking about that. What about this? What about that? 3 things for hydration. It's not that complicated. Give our workers access to fluids within arm's reach. That means we need to give them 5-litre carriers. Yeah. Oh, we can't have a 5-litre carrier where we work. Find a way. Use a camel bag. Use an 800ml bottle clipped on their belt, whatever it takes. Give them access to fluids where they work at the temperature that they want, with the flavour they want. Now, ideally, for me, water would be the go-to drink. But the research shows that flavouring can enhance consumption, especially after extended periods of only consuming water. Not a problem. And most work sites will provide some type of flavouring. Hence our next point. This is the last point on hydration, and it's all about electrolytes. Electrolytes, yeah, it's full of pseudoscience. So we're going to bust it open right now. Here's some ads. Now, I'm not saying these are current, but each of these have electrolytes in them. You can see I had trouble fitting them on the slide. I had 19 different drinks that had electrolytes in an ad, but I'm just using Thirst, Gatorade, Squincher, because you've probably all heard of them. Electrolyte Thirst Aid for Thirst, electrolytes to replenish for Gatorade, electrolyte replenishment for Squincher. Very, very similar. Each are marketing electrolytes to you. And that's really interesting because electrolytes have this special place on work sites and with athletes. I don't know I just don't understand it, but we need to get our electrolytes so we can perform. That's kind of the link. And to me, it's not quite there. But where do we get educated on electrolytes? Because it wasn't a thing. The general public didn't speak about electrolytes. I've tried to research this and it looks like electrolyte usage, the term usage, in the 70s, 80s and 90s really ramped up. And I think as Gatorade in the late 60s became more popular and into the 70s and 80s and took right off, they have been driving, and their industry partners such as Squincher, et cetera, have been driving the education on this topic. So here's an information booklet from Squincher. Now, I'm not trying to destroy Squincher's reputation. I use Squincher as representing all of these so-called electrolyte drink companies, okay? So you can see there's a whole lot of sentences on this slide. So when dehydrated, our bodies need more than water alone. Maybe in a couple of cases, That's a really blasé term. Like you need to be more specific than that. But alone, I can't say 100% that's wrong, because it's kind of true. We need to replace all the essential nutrients we lose through sweat. These nutrients are known as electrolytes. Again, yeah, okay. Blood pressure, fluid balance, and muscle contractions are some of the key functions that electrolytes help regulate in our bodies. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But the way you're doing this, I find inappropriate. This is pseudoscience by stepping us through this. So they're basically saying you're losing electrolytes in your sweat. You need to put them back, and we've got them in our drink, so we've got you. And that to me is a bit too much. The next page, that's page 6, next page. I take strong issue with statements like this. Hydrating without the use of electrolytes may result in life-threatening hyponatremia. Hyponatremia is basically a condition where blood chemistry is diluted outside of its operating range, and it does result in death. You may have heard of cases from the Kokoda trial where guides have been so scared of their clients suffering heat stress that they're told to drink, and they'll stop, have scheduled breaks, and almost forced drinking. And people drink well beyond their needs, well beyond what their brain's telling them to do. But it's on the best advice of someone who's very passionate and just trying to do the best to help them. And they overconsume. And in that environment, with little medical support, it is definitely life-threatening. And we've had several Australians pass away. But that statement is 100% inappropriate. So any one of us watching today, so drinking water, we're putting our life at risk. That's what they're saying. That's totally inappropriate. That shouldn't be allowed in there. If you go down further, I told you about testimonials and pseudoscience. Here's a cracking one. So squincher as a preventative therapy tastes great, scientifically formulated. So let's mention that it tastes good, it's scientifically formulated, and let's have a registered nurse as giving us that quote. But we don't quote the science, pseudoscience. Okay. So I really have an issue with industry bodies, corporations with a vested interest in this space leading the education of our workforce. I don't think it's appropriate. I think we need to change that. So enough of that. It makes me feel nauseous just reading it. Let's look at what's in these fluids. So I'll pick Squincher and Gatorade as the top two. So we've got sodium and potassium as their key electrolytes. You'll see these two electrolytes on all label. So they're not hard to find. I put sugar on this slide as well to give you some indication. So sodium, the salty part of salt, and potassium is pretty important. It's in every living cell. There's some numbers without context. Let's put milk up there, full cream, 600 mils. Yep. So if Squincher, Gatorade, Thorst, all the rest of them, if they're electrolyte drinks, then milk is. All right. Hint, hint. I don't think they're electrolyte drinks. Here's an electrolyte drink. This is oral rehydration salts. Now, if you go to hospital, go to the emergency department and you've got dehydration that they believe you can reverse through consumption and you don't need intravenous fluids, you'll be given either ORS, which is this one, or gastrolyte or clinical hydrolyte. They're typically the three. Go to Royal Darwin Hospital, you get ORS. They won't give it to you in a 600 ml bowl, so it'll be 200 ml at a time. But that is a clinical dehydration beverage. That's an electrolyte drink. Low in sugar, high in sodium, high in potassium. Now, I'm not saying drinking this stuff is better than drinking any other fluid. I'm saying in a certain point, that's required as determined by medical staff, but that's an electrolyte drink. You don't get squinchy when you go to hospital with dehydration, right? I think we need to stop calling these drinks electrolyte drinks. I think that's the wrong use of terminology. But forget drinks. What about food? Food is where our electrolytes are. So these companies pitching to you that you've got to put it back, you've got to put it back. There's probably a lot already in there, but that's fine. You're a heavy sweater, you're drinking pure water all shift and you've skipped your pre-shift meal and you haven't eaten at all. Yeah, you're probably going to be light, but why do that? Why do that? Because we're now going to start educating our workers that food is a great source of electrolytes, right? We're going to steer away from this industry-driven, beverage industry-driven education, and we'll do our own education based upon the evidence. And the evidence says that, yes, you can get your some electrolytes from Squincher Gatorade if you want. And I support you having access to some flavouring. But that flavouring might be lemons. It could be sliced cucumber, which one worker told me about. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be something in a foil packet. but food being the key. So I know we have suppressed appetite. I showed you in the slide that workers report, 27% of our tropical-based workers report suppressed appetite after work. We get that, but you don't need to eat a lot to top up your electrolytes. And I think for those workers that really suffer in terms of trying to eat at work, the pre-shift meal is key. Very important loading of both energy and electrolytes. All right, we'll leave hydration alone. Let's move on to treatment of heat stroke. This is pretty important because we're talking about a life or death situation. And unfortunately, we get this so wrong. It's embarrassing how bad this is done in Australia, and it's not your fault. It's the fault of the overarching bodies who give us this bad information. So here we have an industry journal, so it's Australasian Mine Safety Journal, not a research journal, but a place where people may get quality information, right? And so they've had a paramedic write an article for them last year. I think it was November last year, right? So treating heat stroke. You read that, medics should get a good set of vitals, including tympanic temperature. We've written a paper to say tympanic temperature is rubbish, but I know it's very hard to measure temperature, so whatever. Call for an ambulance. Yep. Resuscitate. Yep. Place victim in a cool environment. So let's get them out of the heat. Good idea. Moisten the skin with a moist cloth and spray and fan repeatedly. You do that in a tropical region, what are we going to be achieving there? I'd tell you, very, very slow cooling rates. Even in hot, dry, is it going to be fast enough to deal with a heat stroke? Remember, heat stroke is core temp that's really, really high. The cells don't like being that hot and they start dying. Most workers will only tolerate up to 30 minutes at 40.5 or greater before cells start dying. I think some workers will be dying well before that. Some workers' cells, will be dying well before that. Now, it's a product of how hot you are and for how long you are, determining how many cells die. Now, that will determine whether it's permanent dysfunction, whether you have permanent brain impairment, liver, kidney, etc., or you end up with multi-organ failure, which precipitates death. And that's what happened to Trooper Lawrence, and that's what happened in the 37 US Army heat stroke deaths. So I'm not sure whether that's aggressive enough, but it's okay because we've got ice packs to the neck, groin, up, and armpit. So we've maybe got 6 ice packs. We've got 2 on each side. Okay, so that's meant to be more aggressive. And this is what we're taught. I get taught this in my first aid annual update. It's rubbish. The research does not support that at all. And I do not blame the journal. I do not blame this paramedic because that is picked up. That is cut and paste from the Australian Resuscitation Council, our peak body in this space. So I wrote a paper because enough of this. I wrote a paper to say, look, is this adequate? And no, it's not. And I mentioned the Resus Council. I call out St. John, Red Cross and Safe Work Australia, but I blame the Resus Council because they determine the curriculum that St. John's, Red Cross and any other first aid provider will teach. They won't teach outside of what's recommended by the Resus Council, being the peak body. And Safe Work Australia will again replicate those same recommendations. And in Safe Work Australia's 2019 management guidance, heat stress management guidance or similar document that's freely available, and I'm sure lots of you have read it, they parrot the same inappropriate cooling methods that we just saw. So I had to write this paper because we need to call this out. So here's what we're talking about. So you've got these 6 ice packs, and the theory is because we've got shallow blood flow around these areas like that, shallow arteries, if we cool that area proximal to the artery, we'll be cooling that blood, and that blood will transfer the coolness throughout the body, dropping core temp. And in theory, that's cool. That's fine. It just doesn't work. Now, we've known it doesn't work for a long time. And Brendan McDermott, who is probably the most well-respected, him and Doug Kasser, both professors, extremely well-respected in the space. He had this to say in a 2009 paper. Okay, he's saying don't do it. Don't do it because the evidence says it doesn't work in 2009. But we're still getting it taught to us in Australia in 2019. That was an issue. We've had a bit of an update, and I'll talk about that shortly. So the key is we've got a worker collapse on our site. We've taken them out of the heat. We've removed their PPE. Now what? And in this picture, you can see they've done the cold compressors to the recommended areas. They've gone a bit further. They've actually put one on the torso, and that's good. Covering more surface area is good. But is this going to save their life? Is this going to send them home? Is this going to stop the brain, liver, and kidney impairment? Cells are dying right as we speak. So is this enough? And if it is, do we have this where the workers are working? It's challenging, right? It's challenging. But we need to sort it because it is life or death. So I thought, why not show you the cooling rates and basically give you the evidence as to why we don't recommend those ice packs. So you can see different cooling, different temperature in the shade results in different cooling. So as we cool the area, cooling rates go up. So you've got cooling rate per minute, and then you've got time to lower core temperature 1 degree. So for Trooper Lawrence, 41.7, he doesn't need his temperature lowered 1 degree. He needs it lowered 3. He needs to get lower than 39 ASAP. And that wasn't achieved early on. Once he got to the hospital, once he got transferred to St. John's ambulance, he was cooled appropriately, but still, when he got to hospital, he was at 41.7. They did everything they could to cool him, but he went so long being so hot that basically had a toxic reaction with his body, and his motor was truly running. So they missed the window to cool. It has to happen ASAP and aggressively. And these methods here are probably on their own not enough. Combining methods, you could speed it up, but on their own, you're probably not going to get it done. What could you do? I put crushed ice ingestion on here. You're not going to be able to feed them any ice, but just in case, I'm sure there's some questions about that. They're the type of cooling rates you get. They're okay. Cold water immersion is it. That's what they should be put in, like 5, 6, 7 degree water. Yeah, that's what we should be doing. Most of you will be saying, no way, like the risk isn't there for us, and no way we're having cold water, and how would we manage that? And that's fine. I get that. This will only be used by a few %. But shouldn't you all get this information and be able to make that assessment yourself? That's what I think. You should be given the evidence, and you determine when you do your risk assessment, the likelihood of this event and the measures we need to control it, as opposed to just being given ice packs and fan cooling. That's not going to be enough. Ice towels are a pretty decent method. So ice towels basically hold water against the skin in the absence of a cool bath. And we utilise that with a lot of our crews in very remote settings. They can take ice, they might have an angle or whatever. They've got ice at their work site, no matter how far they are from a depot. They've got cool towels. And should anyone need treatment, bang, you've got them good to go. And we've utilised this, well, the crews have utilised this in several incidents we've had where things have gone wrong, and they've basically done the work of the paramedics. So paramedics have arrived sometime post. Worker has semi-recovered, core temperature's been dropped. They're suffering some ill effects, but they're not hypothermic anymore. So we believe that the cell damage was either prevented or stopped very quickly, and that's good for their long-term health. So there's an update. There's an update to the Australian Resusc Council, because based upon this evidence and based upon that paper that I wrote in 2019, along with Dr. Richie Gunn from University of Adelaide, we wrote a letter to the Resusc Council highlighting the deficiencies here. We actually wrote a letter to Safe Work Australia initially, and they said, well, we're not changing anything until the Resusc Council gives us that information. Fair enough. Yeah, that's legit. We went to the wrong body initially. So we went to the Resusc Council in, I believe it was maybe November, December. It was before Christmas last year, and said, you need to fix this. Yeah, we're reviewing it. That's fine. We'll get back to you. So live in September 16, just before it's getting proper hot, they've updated their guidance to put cold water immersion in there. But they do state that the evidence is kind of weak for it, which is kind of surprising. We've written a review paper shows it's extremely strong. Exertional heat stroke treated by cold water immersion, the evidence is overwhelming. They don't cite that they have no evidence for recommending the use of ice packs, and it's still in there. But they've updated the guidance, which is a good thing. It's a very good thing, because this is scary, right? When someone gets proper hot. Now, I'm not trying to scare you into having ice baths at your workplace, but I think you should see the difference between appropriate and maybe not appropriate treatment. Now, I've got a clip here from Frontline. It's a fantastic documentary from the States. This one's from Football High. Two young gridiron athletes from Arizona in one summer season had very similar heat stroke cases at a very similar time during very similar weather. And the state was kind of fixed on the outcomes of these two athletes, and the outcome for one was okay. The outcome for the other was not so. So let's play the clip and see what you think.
Well, Donna, Tyler Davenport collapsed from heat stroke after practice on Wednesday morning. Now,
as football season progressed, the whole state was following the progress of Will James and Tyler Davenport, the two boys who had collapsed from heat stroke over the summer.
Tyler Davenport collapsed during a Lamar High School football practice on August 11th. He's been in the hospital ever since.
The two players had both passed out on the field after practicing in the blistering August heat.
We had almost a 3-week span where it was over 100 degrees every day. So you do try to take extra caution. It does make you think a little bit when it's that hot outside.
But you still practice?
Oh, you have to practice. You have to practice to be ready for the season to start. So yeah, we don't cancel practice because of the heat.
Both Tyler and Will were put in medically induced comas in the same ICU at Arkansas Children's Hospital. Both faced the possibility of permanent damage to their organs from the heat stroke.
From comparing notes, it seemed like that they were both having some of the same issues. Will had had damage to his liver, Tyler had had damage to his liver. But we were all real hopeful.
As the weeks passed, Will James slowly began to recover, while Tyler did not. After 3 weeks in the hospital, Will was released, weak and needing kidney dialysis. On the day he left, he visited Tyler for the first time.
It was a really emotional experience because I remember walking to the intensive care unit and I just remember seeing them laying on his bed. Skin was just miscolored. It was kind of like a light orange color. His teeth were just, disarranged from all the drugs they had to put him on. He was in the middle of dialysis. Patches of hair were missing like mine was. It was just a really overwhelming sight.
6 weeks later, Tyler passed away. It was only after Tyler's death that crucial differences between the two boys' cases began to emerge.
He was in the back of the end zone, and coaches and I were somewhere right in here.
Todd Ross is a certified athletic trainer who is at every football practice and game at the private school Will James attends. He was on the field when Will collapsed.
He made it to about the 5-yard line, picked him up, and we started to carry him towards that gate. We got him into the junior high locker room because it was the closest locker room. Since he was unconscious, we opted for putting him in the shower and dumping ice on him after we had started to slow down lower his body temperature.
Doug Casa is a leading expert on heat stroke.
The key to surviving an exertional heat stroke is what you do in the first 5 to 10 minutes. You have to minimize the amount of time that the athlete is hyperthermic. It basically comes down to somewhere between around 105 to 106 degrees. How many minutes are you above this critical threshold for cell damage will impact if the athlete lives or dies.
That's what was at stake for Tyler Davenport on the field at Lamar when he collapsed.
Some of the kids got up and they hollered out, "Coach, something's wrong with TD."
Without an athletic trainer to respond, Tyler's coaches were left to manage on their own.
We got his helmet and shoulder pads off, got cold towels and water on him. At that point, he kind of quit talking, so that's when we called the ambulance and then just covered him in cold towels and water and waited for the ambulance to get there.
As they waited, they tried to cool him down where he had fallen, on the practice field.
How long was he sitting on the field while you waited for the ambulance?
10, 15 minutes after we made the phone call. It might have been less. It seemed like forever.
When he got to the local ER, his temperature was measured at 108.5, and they started maneuvers and getting fluid in him and cooling him off, but the die was already cast with that temp of 108.
I just figured it was, heat exhaustion, bad heat exhaustion, and it turned out to be a heat stroke. I mean, it just goes from not very good to real bad in a hurry.
It goes real bad real quick, as the coach said. It's debilitating. So the whole of Arizona followed this case, and it's very, very sad. And that's what happens when the treatment isn't given when needed. So I'm really passionate about this topic because I don't want you to learn about what could have been done post the event during coronial, during investigation. That's inappropriate. We should be giving you the info you need, and it's from there for you to manage it. And it's important because we've got 10 cases here of workers passing with heat stroke in recent history in Australia. Don't pretend it's not going to happen because it will. There'll be a heat stroke death or 2 or 3 or 4 this season. I'd like to prevent that. We presented a fair bit of info. If you want some more, on our website, there's insights. So you can jump on there. There's some topics that might be of interest. Our latest one is looking at face masks and the research around whether it contributes to heat stress. All the research that we involved in is published and freely available. There's probably 30, 35 papers on the research tab on the website. If you want more info, you jump on LinkedIn and hit us up there. We'll be adding some content there. In the corner, we've got one of the QR codes to sign up to an e-bulletin, which we send out monthly from September through to March. This year we started early. We had a lot to say, so we got stuck in August. But jump on there if you're interested. That concludes the webinar. I'm sure I've raised a few questions. Happy to hear from you. So over to you, Chris.
Matt, let me tell you, I think you've either struck a nerve or a chord with our viewers today. We've already got 8 questions at least. So we're going to get into the Q&A session. And remember, folks, if you do have a question or a comment for Matt, join us on the chat box. Give us your name, your question or your comment, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We may go a little over time, Matt, if that's okay with you, just to get through some of these questions.
Sure.
Okay, let's fire up. First up is Adam Watson. How do we monitor, Matt, to identify heat stress earlier so you don't need to use first aid measures? So avoidance rather than when we get to that critical stage.
Yeah, good question. Like, you can get fully scientific like we do and monitor core temperature. It tends to be a bit full on, and it's definitely not going to be a daily practice. But workers are really smart in heat. They've got a huge IQ when it comes to this stuff. So I think we need to rely on them. Let's collect some responses. So if you want to know what type of heat stress is being endured by the crew, anonymously collect it, whether it's via a web app or old school pen and paper, but get them to detail the symptoms they suffer in these conditions, and you get to learn. You have a database of, right, this weather doing this work equals this much heat stress. We need controls for that. Whereas this work here, no, the crew's saying that's fine, we don't really need to do much here. And then try and understand whether they bring that heat stress back the next day with a heat hangover, or whether they're more at risk. I think old school asking the worker is undervalued. We don't do a lot of it, and we're starting to publish research on that, and we're learning a lot that way, which is guiding our more scientific research as well. So I think let's talk to the workers. Let's rely on their heat IQ as a starting point.
Great question to start us off with. Paul joined us for your webinar this morning, and he asks, can you comment on the validity of the Humidex charts for FNQ conditions?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So Humidex is a decent, it's tough to give you a proper answer to this, but I think in terms of describing the environment, it's a decent metric. If you use a Humidex to then determine work-rest ratios, I think they're tricky, but I think it does a decent job of telling us how hard it is going to be thermoregulating those conditions. But again, trial and error. I'll be looking to collect data not only on how hot and humid the climate is, but as to what symptoms we get during what work in those conditions. You could also do core temperature monitoring and the full scientific stuff, but I really don't think that's necessary first up. I think if you surveyed your crews and maybe even had someone else do the data analysis so they're more confident and more comfortable to be vulnerable and actually say what they're suffering, I think then you'll have an idea of whether that Humidex is actually describing the conditions for the crews adequately. It can be that cooler conditions result in really high work rates and even more heat stress. They don't always line up, so I think we need to do symptom analysis.
All right. MC joined us as well and asks, what can HSRs do to talk employers who ignore heat risks to workers? So getting them involved, getting, they want to change perhaps the attitude and get things right.
Look, ideally they'd be motivated by the health. So I'm talking about the organisation here, the health of their workers, their safety, but it might be a dollar discussion. So you need to talk about productivity. So cool workers go harder in the heat. There's no question about that, right? As we warm up, we tend to slow our work rate because we need to slow that heat production because our body can't keep sustaining how much heat we're storing. So we go slow. And we have many, many employers call us up and say, we're just not getting any work done at this time of year. Yeah, it's because your workers are in survival mode. Some employers call it zombie mode. The afternoon of a hot day, it's zombie mode. No one's getting any work done because they're cooked. And they've been cooked the day before and the day before that. So it might be with a spreadsheet, looking at productivity and looking at costing of a job and basically understanding that, some organisations cost a job and they put in their tender, not factoring in heat, slowing down the workforce. So it could be a monetary discussion. I don't like it getting to that point, but sometimes we have to get there to get a company on board.
Just on that point, if I could ask, is there then a residual heat stress from, say, a day before? And, are you in the clear if, suddenly they were struggling a bit on day one and you got through day one pretty good, and then day two you managed to get over the line, and then you plough on with no changes into day three? Is that a really dangerous scenario that they've got residue from a couple of previous days?
Yeah, it's cumulative, Chris. So these heat hangovers that we've seen, the combination of the fatigue, irritability, the nausea, the rashes, all this type of stuff, that basically it seems to me like our workers come back after a big day in the heat less of who they were. And we do it each day. They might be emptying that battery day by day. I'd prompt organisations to have a look, just say you work 5 and 2, have a look towards the end of the week during hot weather at your stats, at your injury stats. Now, I know your heat stress won't get reported, but the cuts and abrasions, the slip, trips and falls, you might be able to see it. We generally see it. Not only our injuries peak during hot weather, but towards the end of hot weeks. If you're working like 2 and 1, look at those rosters and look towards the end of, I know night shift might mess that around, but have a look at your data. I reckon you'll find some patterns in there around heat. So yeah, good question, Chris. There's definitely a cumulative effect there.
Nice, mate. Let's move on to Pat Watson's question. Pat says, hi, Matt. Do you think there's confusion between cool and cold fluid? And what determines the difference between cool and cold? And will drinking cold water cause issues when dehydrated rather than cool fluid? So it's that cool versus cold, and what's what?
Yeah, so cool generally means around 15 degrees. So there's been lots of palatability studies done on beverage consumption, particularly with water, and it seems like 15 degrees is the sweet spot. That's where most people prefer to consume the fluid, whereas 5 degrees, which is cold water, is less preferred, but generally still more preferred than warm water. Look, I should have mentioned, everyone's individual. And so the research will say this works, but it'll work for some and not for others. And I can't explain through science everyone's preference. I just acknowledge that the research is trying its best. It's doing what it can. However, we're so different. There's so many people doing so many different jobs and have so many individual responses. So I go with preference. If you want to drink cool water, I'd say go for it. And if you're worried that giving someone cold fluids will produce some type of cold shock, then steer clear of it. 15-degree water being used by many other people, the highest preference rate, let's go with cool water. If you want to experiment from cool to cold, then that's fine. But if I was looking at a work crew who didn't have access to cooler fluids, I would start with around 15-degree water. Generally, we'll just give them access to an ice machine, they can sort it out. But we could give them 15 degrees as a starting point and see where this works. See where this works for you. Now, some will say it does, some say no, I want it colder, I want mine full of ice. That's fine. If we had a dehydrated worker, so they've collapsed, they're semi-conscious, we've dropped their core temp, we can give them a drink. I'd just be giving them cool water. I wouldn't have it as a slushy, I wouldn't have it full of ice. I'd be very conservative and just go cool water. It's not going to make a big difference, to be honest. It really isn't. They're not going to take on a large bolus. They might have 100, 150 mil sip. They could vomit it up, but let's go with cool water as a starting point.
All right, thanks, Matt. And thank you to Liz Courtville-Yesi, who joins us today. And Liz has a question for you. She says, hi, Matt. Recommended policy guideline says 30 minutes rest break when temps above 35 degrees. Would you have any recent developments or recommendations or opinions on that theory?
Yeah, I'll start with opinion. My opinion is where that come from. So then I go for the evidence, and I haven't been able to find the evidence. The truth is it's too hard to have a blanket guideline that'll be backed by evidence because, like I said, we're all different. What I do know is that these cutoffs cause their own issues. So let's take Darwin, where we spend a lot of time. It's constantly getting to a max temp of 34, 35. But just say we've got a cutoff of 35 degrees, which we do not have a mandated cutoff up there. But just say we did. It's 33 degrees. It's 9 a.m. I'm the project manager. I know that it's going to hit 35 by about midday today, and it's going to be down tools. Guess what I'm trying to get done before that time? A whole day's work. And so the scheduling, the work rate for those crews is very, very high. And we've actually seen where workers have had to work under this cutoff scheme, not this 35-degree one, but a different one. They work extremely hard. And remember, work rate determines heat production. And if it's hot, 33, 34, 35, that doesn't make a lot of difference. So we see this induced work rate where workers are no longer pacing their effort. They're working to a number or a time limit, and that does induce its own heat stress. So I know these policies are meant to be protective, and they're not always. And I'm a massive fan of workers using their brain to pace their effort through hot weather and being given access to all sorts of resourcing to aid them in keeping their body cool so they can get that job done in the time frame, in an appropriate time frame, with an appropriate amount of co-workers to get that done. That's how we manage heat stress. I'm worried about these cutoffs. Yeah, I'm concerned. I'm concerned about them.
Matt S. Bonner joins us and asks, do you recommend any field metrics to monitor core body temp for risk management?
I like monitoring core temp, which is deep tissue temperature. I do not recognise any other spot as core temperature. There'll be devices marketed to you that they measure skin temp and predict core temp from it. So the only metric around core temp for me is core temp, which is measured generally by an ingestible pill. So that technology has become more available to organisations, but still requires a bit of scientific nous to utilise the data properly, I guess. So yeah, we measure core temp, we do our research, but we do way more monitoring. So we might monitor 20 to 40 workers on a site to get a handle on true scientific responses based upon the work being done, and use that as guidance to help develop a policy based upon evidence. Put in some survey data with that, and you're getting a decent input from what's actually happening out there. I don't rely on any other metrics apart from deep tissue temperature regarding that.
We're on core temps, and Sarah's given us a question on this topic. She says, can you talk through the differences between core temps rise and heat loss for people that are locally acclimatised to hotter weather, such as the people living in Northern Territory, Northern Queensland, in those hotter, humid areas, and those who live in areas that are normally cooler? Should this be managed differently?
Yeah, it should. We need to heat acclimatise our crews prior to deploying. So you might have a team based in southeast Queensland deploying up to far north Queensland. That's a challenge for their body. Their bodies aren't ready. Ideally, would have them gradually exposed to that environment. It might be over the course of the first week that their graduated exposure starts at about 20 to 30% of the rest of the crew, 50, 60% by day 2 or 3, up to about 100% by the end of the week. It's highly dependent upon fitness. Fitness is a massive assistance with that. So people who are active and physically fit tend to heat acclimatise quite quickly. But we need to graduate them. Now, this is an issue because generally crews are deployed without time to heat acclimatise, and FIFO workers, etc. So we published a study in 2016, it's on the website, looking at firefighters from southeast Queensland being flown to Darwin in the morning and starting a 24-hour exercise at 1300, and they worked alongside their Northern Territory colleagues. It was really interesting that the southeast Queensland crews paced their effort once they hit a core temp of 38.2. So both crews were very similar. They're all mixed, so they're not one crew v one crew. They're all mixed, so we could have a mixture of work rates. So they all worked together. 38.2 was the core temp. It was a very similar slope. And then at 38.2, that's when the Queenslanders started pacing their effort, flatlined, and NT crews kept going because they felt more comfortable. The Northern Territory News got hold of that study and wanted to publish a headline saying scientific proof Queenslanders are soft. I don't think it was verified on the data, but there's definitely a difference between heat acclimatised and non-heat acclimatised, and we need to factor it in and give them the time. It's not always commercially viable in our current systems.
Richard Morse had a couple of questions, but let's go with this one because of time constraints. Hi, Matt. Have you got any research on the beneficial effects of cooling PPE, i.e. water-immersed clothing such as sleeves, headwear and neckties?
Look, we haven't done that research. We tend to focus on factors that'll make a bigger difference. So I'll start with the neckties and the cooling collars, etc. They're typically cooling skin temp. They feel good, and that's great. We want workers to feel good, but let's not pretend that it's going to drop deep tissue temperature. So yeah, those type of garments don't do a lot apart from making our workers feel a bit better. And I think that's part of the game. So I'm not saying don't use it, but don't rely on it. In terms of the water perfused garments, we didn't publish, but we did do a bit of work. We've worked with V8s, and obviously they use a cool suit, and we took that into an occupational setting where we had a esky and a pump in there, and we'd plug workers in and put 15-degree water through a T-shirt full of tubes. And it has a bit of a cooling effect. It's not as practical as we'd like, but the research generally comes from military settings. And we're about to publish a paper on cooling rates with passive cooling, but a lot of that passive cooling is compared to other cooling, and I've read all that research. There are some decent perfused garments out there, but they tend to be not used that readily due to practical constraints. But generally, if it's a cooling collar dipped in ice cold water, etc., it's going to make you feel good and nothing else. Water perfused garments can actually drop core temperature based upon how much water and at what temperature it is, and for how long it is perfused, and over what body region.
Kelly asks, does dehydration increase faster moving from hot and cold environments?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
As in moving in and out of,
gotcha.
You go from hot to cold to hot to cold.
It's interesting. We know that some workers, because we promote cooling, and it might be a cooling refuge that's used on site to dissipate some of that excess heat storage. So it might be a crib break or whatever. It might be 20 minutes in there at a certain point in the day. We do know some workers don't enjoy the transition from heat to cold, heat to cold, heat to cold, and we respect that. So we need to use other cooling methods for them. But we've tried to find out why that is. And I don't think it's related to dehydration. It seems to be the rapid change in their skin temp is driving like a nauseous lethargy that we can't find in the research as being explained, but we see skin temp as being a likely candidate for that. I think what you're asking is being out in the heat and then going in a cool environment. Does that cooler environment like draw moisture out of it? So I hear people say like sucks you dry. You want that moisture to evaporate. That's the only way it will dissipate heat. So I'd prefer that going into the cool, you were able to evaporate that heat rather than stay out in the heat. So your sweat rate will be higher out in the hotter environment than it will be in the cooler environment. So if you're talking about dehydration, it's likely to be higher when fully heat exposed as opposed to going in and out of aircon.
Sherry asks, Matt, I work in education and deal with students from prep to year 12. Is it possible that given their age and body size, they are likely to be overcome by heat much faster than adults?
I think the key issue with the kids is their ability to focus on fun and not their bodily responses, and the lack of maturity with their thermoregulation. So they're not able to thermoregulate as per adults. They've probably had less experience and less nous in understanding, I did that the day before, that made me feel like this, so today I'll work at a slightly, no, I'm just going to chase that ball. And so we do see kids. We had a case in the Northern Territory, a colleague of mine actually treated them at a soccer presentation day recently. So yeah, it is an issue for kids exposed to heat, and I think in schools we could do a lot better job. I think we could get better education outcomes in hot climates by using some cooling methods to bring back the rowdy bunch after their break outside into a more focused and teachable group by dealing with that excess heat storage.
One final question. Hayden Tuvey asks, are some people more at risk of heat stress than others? If so, how do you reduce that risk in those people?
Yeah, they are. There's a group of people out there that are heat intolerant. They tend to self-select and maybe they move to Tasmania rather than the Northern Territory. But we see that obviously you go where the work is, and so there are workers that are exposed who may not be as heat tolerant. There's a lot of factors that determine that. You can't just pick it based upon one factor. Managing the risk, I truly believe we need a range of management strategies, controls, call them what you want, for a range of people. And that these workers should have free access to use them as they see fit. If we listen to our brains, no matter how heat tolerant you are, you'll be able to manage your heat stress. If you need to slow down and you have the ability to slow down, if you need to cool and you have the ability to cool, you'll manage it. In our work practices, sometimes that doesn't necessarily happen. So I think giving everyone access to evidence-based cooling, hydration, heat acclimatisation is the key to managing heat stress regardless of their heat tolerance.
Matt, this is a question from me without notice because I've seen your presentation before, and I remember seeing the video presentation, I think of as a trek somewhere that was covered by TV cameras for some reality TV show. And one of the participants ended up dying, overheating body core temperature. This is about, perhaps from a WHS point of view, if you are a company or a business that operates in a very humid, hot conditions, be it Western Australia, Northern Territory, far north Queensland, wherever, and you're talking about it's critical to get that core temperature down quickly, do they need to look at strategies like to get an ice bath, they need to have a facility there on site that can get to their workers immediately to get that treatment or to get that body temperature down to perhaps save that life?
Yes, the answer is yes. Let me go back to these 10 tragic cases. Pilbara worker dies after walking 34 k's over 2 days in hot weather. There was no cooling. Middle of nowhere, there's no cooling. Now, I'm not saying you have an ice bath there. How would you do it? You could. Look, it depends on the risk. So assess the risk. And if the risk is there, then you need to manage it. How are you going to manage it? Some crews use tarpaulins and jerry cans to provide cold water immersion. So jerry cans in the aircon vehicle, you might need 5 to 10 20-litre jerry cans and a tarp. to be able to achieve water immersion in that setting. You might use cold towels. So our go-to method for practicality is to have an esky of ice that doesn't get touched. Good quality esky. Crew might go out for 5 days. Tape that up. You've got other eskies or an Enga or whatever for your day-to-day use, but that's emergency use only. You've got a couple of towels, maybe 3 or 4 towels in that vehicle. Should someone suffer a life-threatening emergency, heat stroke right there and then, you're going to apply those ice-cold towels. You will have ice available. That's because they've assessed the risk, and we said this is your go-to method for practicality and cooling rate. That's the sweet spot. You could take out all that water, probably not that practical for them. And there's probably not enough workers to set that tarpaulin up anyway. So yes, mate, they might need to do that. They might need to drag a trailer, a mobile cool room, to manage that risk if it's a larger crew. That's what you need to be thinking about. And I'd suggest after this session, go and review your heat stroke management procedure. If you don't have one, have a think about how you would manage. How would your crews manage their colleague who was suffering from a heat stroke episode in a remote setting? It's really scary. It's scary for me. I'm meant to know what I'm doing. It'd be very scary for your crews.
Dr. Matt Brearley, thank you very much for joining us today. Can you give us one key take-home message that we should all remember when it comes to heat stroke?
I'll go with heat in general, Chris. I think we need to provide an environment for our crews where there's no stigma to feeling the heat. If we need to manage this, which we do, we need honesty from our crews. So we need to get away from this hero, worshipping the hero who worked until they collapsed. No, that's not what we're after at all. We need honesty from our crews, so when they're suffering from heat, we know, and then we can manage it. So I really push the message that you're not a hero for burying the heat and pretending. You're actually a liability. We need workers rewarded for putting their hand up and saying, I'm not feeling too well. That's where we need to get to.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and I hope everyone has enjoyed your presentation on heat stress, and we thank Dr. Matt Brearley for joining us. Remember, folks, there are still loads of free virtual events to enjoy during Safe Work Month, including a chat with ex-Olympian Hayley Lewis on mental health, and there's still time to register. You can also access heaps of free resources from our website, worksafe.qld.gov.au, including industry and topic-specific video case studies, podcasts, speaker recordings and webinars and films to help you improve your WHS and return to work outcomes. And very shortly, Matt's presentation will be online. Matt's presentation will not be online. I jumped the gun on that one. But if you do have questions, we're still open. The chat box is open, and we'll get Matt to answer those as soon as possible. Thanks everyone for tuning in today and supporting Safe Work Month. Remember, work safe, home safe.